Good morning. I just want to talk about faith today. As I read the book of Mark, I'm just completely highlighted over again to the theme of faith. And I think it's such an amazing story when Jesus walks on water. And I just wanted to read this scripture again as a reminder to whoever needs reminding of what we already know. But sometimes it's easy to forget because we start rowing against the waves when we don't have to be rowing against the waves. So I'm going to read it. It says, later that night, the boat was in the middle of the lake, and he was alone on land. This is because he sent the disciples out in the boat to go ahead of him to Bethsaida, and Jesus stayed on the land. He saw the disciples straining at the oars because the wind was against them. So Jesus is on land and he sees the disciples struggling. He sees them fighting against the storm, fighting against the enemy to get across the lake, warring and battling against the enemy, basically, is what it's representative of. It says, shortly before dawn, he went out to them. So he sees them in the middle of the lake later that night, but he waits until shortly before dawn to go out to them. So he doesn't come immediately to come rescue them. He lets them fight for a little bit. He lets them struggle. He lets them learn their lesson, basically. So then he goes walking on the lake. He was about to pass them by. They weren't even noticing him coming because they were so focused on the storm and the attacks of the enemy against their life that Jesus almost passed them by. But when they saw him walking on the lake, they thought he was a ghost. So they noticed him, but not for him. They actually thought that he was a ghost. They thought it was something else coming against them. They didn't recognize him for Jesus. And they cried out because they all saw him and they were terrified. Immediately he spoke to them and said, "Take courage. It is I. Don't be afraid." So what I notice here is it says take courage. It doesn't say have courage. It says take it. So when you're lacking courage, when you're lacking faith, when you're full of unbelief, you rebuke it, you dismiss it, and you take your faith from the enemy. You take your courage back. You have to have that authority over it and receive it back. So it is I. Don't be afraid. And then he climbed into the boat with them. So now he's with them. And the wind dies down. They were completely amazed, for they had not understood about the loaves, and their hearts were still hardened. And then it says, when they had crossed over, they landed at Gennesaret and anchored there. And as soon as they got out of the boat, people recognized Jesus. And they ran throughout the whole region and carried the sick on mats wherever they heard he was. And wherever he went, into villages, towns, or countryside, they placed the sick in the marketplaces. They begged him to let them touch even the edge of his cloak, and all who touched it were healed. So one thing I noticed in the book of Mark is that every time they go in to get a boat to cross that lake, there's some sort of a faith testing. There's some sort of a storm. And when they do cross the lake and there's no storm, that's when their faith is high, like right before the lows. But every time they get to the other side of the lake, immediately there are a crowd of people there to meet them. Immediately they go into ministry. As soon as they get through their faith testing and the storm, Jesus immediately is put to work. The disciples are immediately put to work or training, and it is time. And so it just shows the pattern of the Lord and how he works. And then it says they begged him to let them touch even the edge of his cloak, and all who touched it were healed. And that's after the woman with the issue of blood had touched his garment, and she knew if she could just touch his garment that she would be healed. But I had a revelation last night about this. This is before he died on the cross. This is before he died on the cross, and they just knew because he was there among them, and if they could just touch his garment, they'd be healed. But how much better are we set up now than they were back then? Back then they got to see him and walk with him, but they didn't get to have his spirit inside of them. They didn't get to put Jesus on like a garment. They weren't wearing Jesus. The Bible literally says that we put Jesus on as our garment. He's our righteous white robes. So if they were healed just by touching the hem of his garment, then why aren't we healed when we're wearing him 24/7? when we're filled with His Spirit, when we speak His word out of our mouth, when we hold Him in our hands, when we read our Bible. It's because we haven't had the revelation and we're lacking the faith. But we're supposed to be doing greater works. We're set up in a greater measure than they were. And it's time we realize it. It's time we realize it and go forth the way He's called us to go forth, because we're not touching the hem of His garment. We're wearing it. We're putting Him on as righteous white robes. Get a hold of that.